Good evening. So this is, wow, what a sound. This is case, I think it's 29 of the Blue Cliff record. So a monk asked Dasu, okay, so when the Kalpa fire comes and destroys the entire world system, is this one destroyed or not? And Dasui says, destroyed. And then he says, okay, fine. So does it go along with it? And Dasui says, it goes along. Which sounds pretty, I don't know, final or grim or something. But anyway, so in the widest possible view, life is, depending on how you look at it, either just inextricably entangled with memory, or else actually just is memory. Right? And I tend to fall on the side of the life is memory proposition. Right? So if you look back, so there's a whole bunch of theories about the origin of life, but my favorite one is there's this sort of evolutionary biologist by the name of Nick Lane who wrote a book called The Vital Question. I don't know if anybody's ever read it. It's a very good book, but he makes the claim that life arose in serpentinizing deep ocean vents, right? And that the idea is that there are these vents that make this sort of rock sponge, right? And in these little tiny chambers in this rock sponge, it was possible to have enough kind of simultaneous stability and flow of chemicals of various sorts to establish the chemistry of life. And when you look at the chemistry of life, his claim is that that primary memory mechanism is remembered in part because with using these minerals that kind of have the signature of serpentinizing deep ocean vents, which is kind of an amazing proposition, right? So we have pieces of ancient open ocean crust like floating around in our body chemistry, right? And the other good part about that is that the relics of serpentinizing deep ocean vents are just planted all over Mount Tamalpais. So you can go up, walk up on Mount Tam and see a big pile of green rock. And the interesting thing about serpentine is that hardly anything can grow in a serpentine outcrop, right? So there are these bare spots that were this wild-looking green rock, and you're like, origin of life. Nice. It probably didn't happen in the ones that are on Mount Tam. It happened, ages ago. But anyway, so from that point, like the process continued, right? And the life remembered how to live, and then got more complicated and started burning more energy and got more multi-layered and multicellular, and and then after a while there was us, and it's been about, I think, something like 1/3 or so of the entire life of the universe, as far as we know, that's been going on here on this planet, which is kind of remarkable, right? That's a long time. Nobody really has a clear idea at all about when, mind arose, right? And up until quite recently, in this kind of, modern Western culture, Euro-American culture or something like that, the assumption was that only humans had one, right? And if you were religious, it was humans and some other spirit beings, gods, demons, angels, and so on and so forth. And everybody else didn't have one, right? But by now it seems pretty inescapable, the evidence seems pretty undeniable that a huge variety of animals non-human animals have mechanisms that are similar to or exactly like ours, mental mechanisms, and also even the ones that aren't particularly similar, like there's a bunch of fish that are extremely smart, right? They nonetheless seem to display a kind of self-awareness and sentience, right? Remarkable. And so we're that should give us all pause, right? But we have no idea what their mind is like, but from the way we experience it, sort of conventionally, let's put it that way, it's kind of like it's like the frosting on this incredibly deep layer cake of memory-based life mechanisms that go all the way down to the sub-cellular level with things like mitochondria, right? And the frosting part, the part that we're usually mostly aware of and conscious of, has a number of qualities. One is that it's really, really tangled up with language, right? Like it's when I've probably told everyone in this room this story, but I'll tell it again anyway. Like when my daughter Deirdre, who's now, I guess, 34 and a college professor in Pittsburgh, was about 2, we were talking on the phone, and she said, Dad, I just discovered today that I can talk to myself without talking out loud. And I was like, yeah. And then I was also like, oh. Because, that's essentially how it starts, right? You discover that you can tell the story of your life, right? And to yourself, and that story comes with, over time, that story gets more elaborate, and also we learn the sort of emotional constructs that go along with it, that underscore our self-narrative thoughts. In fact, that underscore pretty much every thought, right? I'll digress a little bit. There's a book called Descartes' Error that's essentially about this, and it has a case study where it references a case study where there's this guy, a neuroscientist, who was working with a a man who was a working lawyer, but during the course of his adult life, he'd had some disease that had kind of wrecked his ability to attach emotional weights to thoughts, basically. So there's very little emotional drive in his sort of everyday cognitive activity. And the neuroscientists and cognitive psychologists would do these experiments where he'd say, okay, you need to sign this document here. And he'd plunk down 3 pens on the table, right? And the guy would sit there like, because he couldn't generate a sufficiently strong preference to pick up one pen over another, right? I mean, so it really is a big deal, right? The emotional drivers of our everyday thinking, right? Mm. And also that sort of everyday conventional cognitive mind, right, that we carry around with us, and that a lot of people think is the only way there is to be, right? You know, the book Descartes' Error is named Descartes' Error because, well, for a number of reasons, but one of the things he critiques is the whole notion of I think, therefore I am, right? That's not exactly right, right? And in fact, it's a common mistake, right? That mind is, well, let me say one additional thing there. Obviously, this sort of philosophical stance about the nature of mind has a name, and it's usually called physicalism, right? The idea that, well, that mind is embedded in body, right? The critiques of physicalism almost always make this error in their argument, which is that that they accuse the physicalists of saying that mind is the same as body, right? That's not true, okay? It's like the body is a physical machine and substrate, and mind is an emergent process that has completely different characteristics and is, in many ways like autocatalyzing, obviously with help from the underlying substrate, but it has its own. It's its own thing. It's a different thing. If it's a physical, if the name of the philosophical stance is physicalism, then this is the metaphysics of physicalism, right? It's metaphysical, right? And even more interesting, that mind is constructed, because it's so richly entangled with language, it's constructed entirely out of things that people have said to each other, right? And said to me, right? Mine is made out of things that people have said to me. That's how I learned the language that I self-narrate with, right? And that's how I learned the emotional constructs that go along with it, right? By observation and listening, right? And so the metaphysics of physicalism has to include the fact that it's actually mind is actually kind of a shared field of mental activity, right? It's mental activity, speech, and observation, and it goes back into the depths of time, right? It's almost the same as ancient twisted karma. In fact, it's a component of ancient twisted karma, right? Mm. So the whole kalpa fire thing, in South Asia, pre-Buddhism, like I think the Vedas and the Upanishads, certainly in the Upanishads, there's this scheme for describing the universe, the time scales in the universe, right? And the idea is there are these incredibly long periods called kalpas. They're estimated, or when people do all the math on them, they're a little over 4 billion years long, right? And they're each divided up into a number of periods, sub-periods that are called yugas, right? And I forget the names of all the rest of them, and for reasons that will become obvious in a second. But the last yuga in each kalpa is called Kali Yuga, and Kali Yuga is named after the sort of goddess of destruction, right? And it's the really bad one. It's also the shortest, but it's also the worst, right? Like things go really badly, everyone's awful to each other, et cetera, and then the whole world comes apart, and this massive fire comes up, and it burns everything. And the name of that event is the pralaya, right? So when the monk was asking Dasui about what happens, he's talking about the pralaya, and the notion that was in place at the time of the Buddha, and as far as I know is still in place, is that we're really kind of getting near the end of the present Kali Yuga, and that the end is near, basically, and the fire is going to show up kind of soon, right? Time is it? I don't want to talk too much. But I'm already doing it, so sorry. It's not totally clear to me that Dasui and the monk really believed this in this system, right? It sounds to me like they're mostly just using it as a way of talking about the nature of life, mind, and consciousness, right? But even if they were, we can do that, right? And what's fascinating about their exchange, right, is that it's, Dasui takes a very kind of straightforward view of the nature of I've sort of already said this, of the nature of mind and body, consciousness and body, and he's basically saying, like Suzuki Roshi says, that they're not one and not two, right? They're interdependent, they're connected, they're deeply entangled and inextricable, right? So the pralaya, also well before Buddhism, was used as a metaphor for states of mind that were available usually through meditative practice or yogic practice, that in which the activity of conventional cognition would cease or settle or recede into the background, leaving a a broader field, basically. And in the context of that broader field, other things can happen, right? So that includes what people usually talk about as enlightenment, right? And it's probably the case that that Dasui and the monk were also talking about that, right? So how does that work, right? What time is it? I just remembered I was going to read you a poem and I forgot the piece of paper it's on, so I apologize for that. All I had to do was bring this and a piece of paper, okay? If we, in the context at least of Zazen and elsewhere as well, it's the case that over time, this other mode of engagement, comes into view, right? It does it on its own time and in its own way, and it's not always the same experience, and sometimes it's really obvious and riveting, and sometimes it's subtle, right? But in any case, it comes into view, and we can practice with that. And in the context of that practice, one of the things that becomes tremendously clear, right, is that this activity that we've been talking about, the activity of bringing perceptions, up from our essentially sensory hardware, contact between our sensory hardware and the world of form, right? And measuring their valence, and then allowing them to the ones with the powerful valence to arise to the level of perception, which is, again, it's the reason for that is that those perceptions in the light of awareness are input to our storehouse consciousness and outcomes stuff, mental activity, right? That's critical to everything about what it is to be human, right? And so some of the things that it is to be human that's critical to are marvelous, right? We have this capacity to, write poetry, for example, even though we have this capacity to forget to bring it. We have a capacity to make elaborate long-range plans and cooperate smoothly with people to implement them, and it makes, among other things, smartphones and green tea ice cream, right? Wonderful. And then the other fact is that it's at the core of our our self-delusion and suffering, right? Because again, our memory is great, but it completely reflects only our own very narrow path through the world and the things that people had to say to us along that path, right? That's it. That's what we've got. And then after a while, we could read some stuff too, right? So, it's maybe some Buddhist literature or something, right? But that's what we've got. We have this really limited view, and our capacity to understand is dwarfed by the whole universe of things that we can't know and can't understand. How could we not delude ourselves? and so this activity of laying down memory traces and picking them up and acting on them based on their emotional drivers is something to be careful and discerning with, right? And I think most people will tell you that those things happen automatically. It's like, they just said this thing and I got mad and I hit him. That particular mechanism wants to be free to operate without intervention, right? And it sort of operates in this sort of conscious to semi-conscious realm, and so it's hard to look at, right? Hard to watch. But in the presence of big mind, it becomes quite visible, actually. You can really see how it's working. Usually our periods of being able to do that are limited by this cycle of attention we have, where normally our attention is being pulled from broader awareness to pretty focused awareness on the process of cognition, and then, opening back up again to pay attention to the world, right? But over time, it becomes more possible to hold everyday mind in the context of big mind, right? And when that happens, it's possible to soften the emotional drivers of our habit, energy, and habitual response. It becomes possible to see other possibilities, right? It becomes possible to move deliberately and see the spaces in between recognizing, responding, and acting, right? So the last thing I wanted to say is this. There's this phrase that shows up all over the Zen literature, the idea of leaving no trace, right? And I would say that, based on what I've been talking about for the last little while, it's impossible to leave no trace. Like what we do in life is we leave traces in our minds and we leave traces in the minds of others. That's what we do, right? But the leaving no trace is kind of a nod to the Taoist notion of wu wei, right? Non-doing. No, non-doing doesn't mean not doing anything. It means doing things in such a way that the activity is so wholehearted and untainted by self-regard that even though you're sitting there working your ass off, nobody, including you, even knows it, basically. That's kind of non-doing. And that's leaving no trace. That's kind of the best we can do. So should we chant and then have questions, or what should we do?
No, questions first.
Great, let's do some questions. Do we have time for a few, or?
We have time for maybe one.
Oh,
If you have a question, please raise your hand, and I'll bring a little microphone over. You'll need to speak into this little microphone.
it is so little. Oh. So, any questions?
If you have a question, raise your hand and speak loudly.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm curious what you believe happens to consciousness, or what this koan would say happens to consciousness when there's no longer the body. Maybe if you could elaborate on what Suzuki Hiroshi meant.
Yeah.
Discussing this topic.
I mean, it's a great question. I personally think that the proposition not one, not two means that even though they're not the same, they're sufficiently interdependent so that if the body goes away, the mind goes away, and with humans, if the mind goes away, the body goes away, right? It's a cooperative, emergent process, but it needs to emerge from some substrate and mechanism, right? And if you think about it, like, okay, so in a disembodied being, where is the storehouse consciousness stored? There's got to be something, right? And if you observe the day-to-day activity of your mind, what is it usually taken up with? What would you say?
Main things I have to do with material objects.
Right. But I would say more constantly, it's the constant absorption of information from the phenomenal world, moment by moment, in a river of information, a flood of information, right? That we barely take it in. I mean, our strategy for that is take in a bunch of information, throw away 90% of it, hammer the rest of it into a little frame, and go, okay, this is reality. But we're doing that every moment. That the activity of thinking, as we conventionally cast it, is famously kind of low bandwidth compared to the activity of just standing in one place and taking in the world, right? I mean, and by low bandwidth, I mean multiple orders of magnitude lower in bandwidth, right? Anyway, that's kind of my take on it.
You can do one more.
Great. Anyone?
I just want, can you please put some light on you say that we are our thoughts and that's our mind in your talk? You describe it, our thoughts is our mind and they're different from our body.
I would not say that we are our thoughts. I would say some people think that, but I would not say that at all. I would say we're a child's ball floating on a river, basically, the river of the phenomenal world, and we we're a nexus of energy and information in the in this, you know, vast four-dimensional river of phenomenal activity. And one of the things that we do is we occasionally produce a thought. Does that help, or? Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.